It's time for the press review with Alison Sargent. Good to see you, Alison.
Hi, Delano.
You're starting in Israel, where the country's papers are reacting to news that the director of Human Rights Watch has been expelled.
That's right. The Jerusalem Post calls it the end of one of the most controversial fights ever between Israel and one of its human rights critics. Omar Shakir was deported under a 2017 legislation that allows Israel to deport those it deems to be supporters of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, otherwise known as BDS. His deportation was approved by Israel's Supreme Court earlier this month. The Jerusalem Post notes that while the UN and the EU have condemned the decision, they say many Israeli politicians, including centrist politicians in Israel, do support it.
Now, the same is not true of all Israelis, of course, because the left-wing paper Haaretz has an editorial opposing his expulsion.
That's right. They oppose his deportation for several reasons. First, they say Israel is ultimately going to be the one most hurt by this entire affair. Shakir will continue carrying out his role as regional director for Human Rights Watch. He'll be operating from neighboring Jordan, and he will be, according to Haaretz, quote, living proof of Israel's efforts to whitewash its policy of occupation. Most troubling for Haaretz, though, is the way in which they say Israel is branding people who oppose the occupation as enemies of the state. The paper says there are actually many people in Israel, many Israelis, who hold the exact same views as Shakir. And after foreigners like him are getting deported, they say it will surely be the turn of those rebellious Israelis.
Moving to France next, where papers are looking ahead to next week's rolling protests.
That's right.
Things are going to
get rough for us. December 5th, everyone in France is marking their calendar for transportation chaos. The government is holding their last meeting with unions today before that strike happens. Street paper 20 Minutes says the government is going on the counteroffensive. We see Prime Minister Edouard Philippe there on their front page. He's the one spearheading this meeting with unions later today. According to right-wing paper Le Figaro, the government is really trying desperately to win the battle for public opinion, particularly when it comes to their retirement reform. Le Figaro says the government's strategy is basically to paint transportation workers who are fighting to keep their retirement benefits as being privileged. The paper, though, is skeptical about whether that will work, and it's true that when we think about metro drivers, they're not exactly the portrait of the privileged population.
Indeed. Now, a left-wing paper, Libération, has taken a more global view on these protests.
That's right. They have a series of polls out in their paper today. They say that the social ills, that 9 out of 10 people think that these current social ills amount to a full-on social crisis. For Libération, though, the root of this social crisis comes from that statistics that we do see on their front page today. The majority of people in France, 64%, think that President Macron fails to understand the reality of the difficulties that people are facing. Despite the impending strike, the president has vowed to move full speed ahead with his retirement reform, which for Libération cartoonist Willem seems to mean that the president is just asking to get run over. We see him there laying down on the tracks. He's saying, "The strike doesn't scare me."
Moving to India next, where the country's Supreme Court has come out with strong words for the government over that pollution crisis that continues in the north of the country.
That's right. This is a very strongly worded rebuke from the Supreme Court, a part of which is reprinted today in the Times of India on their front page. India's Supreme Court said that living in New Delhi is worse than hell, like living in a, quote, gas chamber. They accused the local and national governments of politicizing the issue of pollution rather than actually doing anything about it. Particularly, the paper says that they've really failed to enforce bans on farmers burning crop stubble on their fields, which is a big contributor to air pollution. They also gave the government a deadline for setting up smog towers to filter the air in New Delhi. Otherwise, as things are now, the Supreme Court concludes that it would be better for the Indian government to, quote, just kill people in one go with explosives. So again, powerful words from the Supreme Court.
It helps when the Supreme Court is based in Delhi, so the justices have to breathe the air too. Getting on to some lighter news next, Alison. Swiss paper Le Temps is looking at friendships about vampire bats. What are vampire bats?
That's right, vampire bats. They're bats that suck blood, so they don't sound like particularly friendly creatures, but it turns out that they are capable of becoming friends for life, at least according to this headline from Le Temps. This article talks about work from researchers at the University of Ohio in the United States. They studied what happened when a group of female vampire bats that had been held in captivity captivity altogether, was then released into the wild, and they found that many of those bats maintained close friendships with each other. Some of them even did things like regurgitating their own food to feed it to a friend who didn't have enough. And I think it's sweet. It's not disgusting.
I'm not a fan of this story.
It is
Switch on. Let's go.
I just said sweet, Delano, and I think you can think of it as, we say BFF, best friends forever, but we could say bat friends forever.
I will not be saying that.
Had to get it in there.
And a last story from you, Alison, about an 82-year-old woman who got into a fight with her intruder.
That's right. A man broke into her house and she beat him up, which sounds kind of surprising when you think about an 82-year-old woman, but not when you look at this woman. She is not just any 82-year-old woman. She is an award-winning bodybuilder. Her name is Willie Murphy. She gave a serious beating to a man who broke into her home. We have to say, though, he was drunk. He was pretty intoxicated, so it was probably not an entirely fair fight. She told reporters that she hit him so hard with a table that the table broke, and she ultimately did not file any charges against him, although you could say he got punishment enough with the beating he took. Delano, I think there are several morals to this story. One, be careful whose house you break into, and two, you cannot judge strength based on age.
Good for her.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Alison. Alison Sargent there with a look at the day's press review, and you can follow other editions of our press review on our website. The address is france24.com.